Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. I hope wherever you are, you're staying warm and staying safe. And we're thinking of everyone in the UP and the upper northern lower peninsula that's been facing many challenges with the weather. And then some of us, obviously, in mid-Michigan have also been experiencing that today as well. We're going to get started here. So let me go ahead and share our PowerPoint. If you'd like to, just say hello in the chat. You can put your name and your program. It's great to see everyone. We are recording. I have gone through and just put everyone on mute. Because I know that many of us are doing other things as we're listening in. But good morning and welcome again to our professional development for today, the intersections of adult and special education. You know, just one of those low-hanging fruit topics that we wanted to provide this professional development opportunity on. But we're obviously want to prioritize this and feel like this is such an important topic for all of us. We're so excited to have a special presentation from Driscoll from the Michigan Alliance for Families. One of our great member partners, Oogie from the Kenai ISD, will talk about some of the wonderful work and terrific job that he's been doing around building a really county-wide platform to support adult education services in Kent County. And then we'll have a few updates from our McKay High School Equivalency Committee. And again, as want to welcome all you all, you can put your name and your program in the chat, and we will get started right away. So we're very happy to see you, and we'd like to extend an invitation to connect and join with our High School Equivalency Committee. And if Whitney Detmer, our chair, is on for that committee, I wonder if she'd like to say a few things, Whitney.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I'm always recruiting for our committee. Not only is it the best committee, but this is a topic that comes up often. In our committee, it turns to chit chat of helping to problem solve for everybody's programs. So it's been a great group to get ideas, help each other out. We do plan a PD usually every February. This was ours this month, just because this is a recurring topic and we all just need some answers. So if you like to learn from each other, we do GED, HiSET, and diploma, and really we're there to problem solve. So thanks, Patrick.
And they're a fun bunch. So
Yeah.
it's just nice to be surrounded by professionals that understand the dynamics that we all work in and can share frustrations when those pop up, but also share really helpful resources and ideas too. And Whitney does a great job leading that committee and on our board of directors as well. So thank you so much, Whitney.
Welcome.
And team. Just a couple of housekeepings for everyone. We have changed our format for submitting sketches. And so I'm going to go right now into the chat and put in the link for the sketch form. And I'm going to also share my screen so that you can see it. Let me reshare. So what you will do is go into the chat, click on that sketch form link. If you're looking for sketches, it asks for your email, your name, your personal identification code if you need sketches. And then there is a drop-down box and you will select the intersections of adult and special education and then click submit. So we hope that that process is easier. Allow us up to 2 weeks to submit those sketches. Judy, our admin assistant, works very diligently to do that. And so appreciate everyone going in there and doing that if you do need sketches. We are, again, recording today's topic and discussion, and all the materials will be made available to you in their entirety. And something for all of our professional development this year is that if you register for any of the PD and can't attend live in person, you can still go back and rewatch those and still apply for sketches through the end of May. So I know sometimes, we can't attend on that day or time, but we're really trying to expand the opportunities that are available to everybody throughout the course of the program year. And as always, if you got questions or comments, you can put them to the chat. If you've got technical difficulties with anything, let me know and I'll do my best to answer and respond to those. And then certainly with our presenters, we'll get questions to them as well. So let's get started. Our agenda for today, we've already done our housekeeping. We're going to have a fantastic presentation from the Michigan Alliance for Families, followed by some time for Q&A and really some conversation. We have some questions that we've asked Michelle to address and then certainly open it up to the audience as well. And then we got a wonderful presentation from Oogie at the Ken ISD, Oogie Lamar, and we'll kind of end kind of wrapping up in next steps for today. Something else that Whitney and I, as we were looking to pull this together, we thought it is important to set the tone for today and talk about the landscape of adult and special education, which if we're talking about landscape, and I'm going to use this as the metaphor, it's rocky. There's some valleys. There's maybe some quicksand. There's like maybe a mudslide or two. Maybe a twister just came through. I mean, it is, there's not all green pastures. However, I think what's important to remember is that our participants that we're working with need to be at the center of all of our decision-making and our planning. And if we can keep that perspective, I think that will carry us through the day and through many of the difficulties that we often get bogged down with policy and administrative oversight. And as Michelle and I were talking before we came on, sometimes we just get in our own heads about how complex things are, right? And it's a matter of starting that process after some deliberative discussions with colleagues and making sure that we are understanding all of the parameters before we start. Something else that I think is important to lay out is that we're probably not going to solve all the world's problems today, but this is definitely a start to an ongoing conversation. So we just want to put that out there that we know that there are some large questions that may need more research, more discussion, and more identification. And so we want to acknowledge that and just raise it up to everyone as well. Something else to recognize is that under federal and Michigan special education statute, a student's individual district of residence is considered the educational entity responsible for the delivery of special education services in coordination with adult education services. There are a lot of conjunctions there that are important, and there's a lot of verbs there that are important. We know and recognize that across the state, that may not be happening widely. It may not be being enforced in that model, but that is current statute. And until policy changes, that is the law. And we do need to follow that law, and we need to respect that law, not only because it's the law, but because of the best interest of the participants that we're trying to serve. So I know that that's very general, and probably I should have italicized some of those conjunctions, but it is that district of resident for that participant, as well as the special education services there, working alongside our adult education programs. The other thing Whitney and I thought would be important to say is that there are additional resources for the population in adult education above age 26. Just because you turn 27 doesn't mean that your learning challenges or any impairments or difficulties that you have go away suddenly. And so there are additional resources, and we know that we need to continue to coordinate that and to investigate additional resources. But our primary focus today will be on the 18 to 26 population. We'll probably touch upon, I think, in Oogie's presentation and at the end, additional resources that are available for those other populations. And certainly we could have a whole professional development about that as well. And we plan to kind of look in different spaces to do that. And the last thing I would just share is that there is a work group that is convening right now and talking about this important issue. It's called the Free and Appropriate Public Education, the FAPE, F-A-P-E, for Adult Education Work Group. It has been convened by the Department of Education and the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. I, as a representative of McKay, sit on that group. Many people on this call are also on that group. I will say that I think the outcomes for that are still much anticipated of the direction of where that committee is going, but the initial goal was to better understand the current landscape and to really make recommendations, and that's a general word, recommendations around how to improve the current system and the coordination between adult and special education services. So in lieu of that, and in lieu of, the folks that are in the ivory towers, we know that the work still goes on each day, and we're still working, and we need to find some interim solutions and make some best practices available to everyone. So today we might not be able to change, like I said, all the world's problems, but we certainly are putting forth best practices, evidence-based materials for you all to have access to. So I wanted to raise that up so that we're all on the same page with that. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'll stop talking, but Michelle Driscoll is the policy coordinator for the Michigan Alliance for Families. She is a contracted educational advocate, and really, we were just talking, has over 30 years, almost 40 years of educational advocacy experience in working with individuals with the Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education, MARS, Michigan Department of Education policy, state performance plan, state systemic improvement plans. If there's anything out there, she's probably worked with it. And she has a lot of experience of working across different systems and understanding the landscape and the nuances, particularly that our adult education programs face every day in the administration and programmatic side of things. She works as a liaison with the Office of Special Education, so she's up to date and abreast of a lot of things happening and what's going on, and really works to facilitate and gather information in coordination with that office and to share with advocates all across the state, as well as associations like ours. She works with the Michigan Alliance for Family staff, other statewide parent organizations, and other stakeholders to really provide these type of training opportunities. She'll, at the end of the presentation, will be sharing some additional PD that they have available. That's absolutely fantastic. But I'm going to go ahead and welcome Michelle and turn it over to her. And I'll also be putting her resources that she will be talking today in the chat as well. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
We can. Thank you, Michelle.
Great. Perfect. I always love when technology works right. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you and share my presentation this morning about special education state complaints and resolving special education issues using informal and formal processes. And just want to tell you a little bit about Michigan Alliance for Families. In case you are not familiar, we are a statewide resource. We provide information, support, and education to families of children and young adults from birth to age 26 who receive or may be eligible to receive special education services. And Michigan Alliance for Families is an IDEA grant-funded initiative of the Michigan Department of Education, Office of Special Education, as well as Michigan's Federal Parent Training and Information Center, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. So we hold both the state and the federal grants for that. And our work across both really overlaps with our goals and providing information and support to families. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I know our time is limited. I'm going to jump into the presentation. I always start with a page of acronyms. Our content is really developed with families in mind. So I don't think I need to go through all of this with you, but I want to make sure that this is in the information in the PowerPoint. And Patrick is going to put the link to, there's a participant website that we have that has the PowerPoint and the handouts on it. So Patrick is going to put that link in the chat and you'll have access to the PowerPoint and then all of the supplementary handouts that go along with this presentation. I also want to mention that in this presentation, I'm going to refer to students. I'm going to say students and parents and schools. And when I'm referring to students in this presentation, I'm talking about students who are 18 years or older and have a legal right to make their own educational decisions, meaning they don't have a court-appointed guardian who's making those decisions for them. And when I refer to parents, as defined in Mars, this could be a biological or adoptive parent, a guardian who's authorized to make educational decisions, a surrogate parent appointed by the school, or a person appointed by the court. So I'm just using that term parent to cover all of that. So I'm going to be talking about federal regulations and state rules about dispute resolution. I'm going to review information options available to students, parents, and schools to resolve disagreements. And then I'm going to focus the remainder of the session on the what, who, why, when, where, and how of the formal state complaint process. These sections of the IDEA cover mediation, filing a state complaint, and confidentiality of information, as well as the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education about state complaints. So if you want to know exactly what those rules and laws say, you can take a look at those sections. In case you're not aware, Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education put out 2 guidance documents last year, I believe it was in June, special education state complaints, procedures and model forms, and special education dispute resolution options. And I'm going to be talking about information that is explained in more detail in those documents, and those are in your participant handouts. So there are several dispute resolution options available to address disagreements between students, parents, and schools regarding the education of students with disabilities. And I always like to start out talking about the least adversarial processes first, hoping that through effective ongoing communication and the use of the options that issues can be resolved before filing a state complaint or a due process complaint. So I'm going to discuss informal meetings, reviewing and revising the IEP, meeting facilitation, mediation, and then I'll focus, of course, on special education state complaints. The due process complaints requesting an administrative hearing can be used for certain violations of the IDEA or MARS. And there's more information and a comparison of all the dispute resolution options in your participant handouts. There's a chart called the Quick Guide to Special Education Dispute Resolution Processes for Parents of Children and Youth from the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution, CADRE. So that document is in your handouts as well. And it's a very extensive and thorough chart if you want to compare each of these options. The IDEA and MARS encourage informal resolution of disagreements between students and parents and schools. And the most effective options involve early and meaningful communication in a collaborative manner. So if a student or a parent has a disagreement or an issue of concern regarding a student's education, they're encouraged to reach out to the teacher, principal, or special education administrator as soon as possible. Informal meetings allow students, parents, and schools to work together, preserve relationships, and avoid costly hearings. And this option also allows decisions to be reached faster without intervention from a third party. Informal meetings can be used to discuss any topic. It's not just limited to special education issues. And anyone can be involved in an informal meeting who may be helpful in getting the issues resolved, including school personnel and outside private service providers that the parent has invited or student has invited to participate. A meeting can be held specifically to review or revise the student's IEP and make changes as an IEP team. In this case, all relevant members of the IEP team should be present for the meeting. The review can be to discuss a particular concern, discuss a change in service or a needed accommodation, and the entire IEP may not necessarily need to be reviewed at that time. And there's no cost, of course, to the family or to use this option. The meeting can be requested by the student, the parent, or the school to resolve the issues that they're that are in disagreement. Meeting facilitation is more formal than the informal meeting process and can be used as soon as a meeting is scheduled. Any special education meeting, such as an IEP meeting, a manifestation determination review, or a meeting to develop a behavior plan, or any other special education meeting can be facilitated. A neutral trained facilitator can help promote effective communication, keep the discussion focused on the issues at hand, and coordinate the conversation so all parties can share their thoughts and ideas. And facilitation can be used when relationships are strained or participants are feeling uneasy about a meeting and they'd like a neutral third party to kind of help steer that conversation. This process is voluntary, so the student or parent and the school must agree to participate, and the student, the school, or the parent can ask for a meeting facilitator, and there's no cost to the family or the school to use meeting facilitation. The meeting facilitator will develop an agenda based on input from the student, the parent, and the school. They'll stay neutral, they'll facilitate the meeting if they're asked to. They'll keep the discussion focused on the issues at hand and help the participants work through their disagreements. The facilitator makes sure that everyone follows the ground rules set forth at the beginning of the meeting and keeps track of the time. A facilitator is not part of the team, doesn't give legal advice, doesn't make decisions or advocate for a particular position related to the issues that are being addressed. Mediation is available at any time, even if a state complaint or due process complaint has been filed. Mediation is scheduled at a mutually agreeable time. The student, the parent, and the school choose to participate in a confidential, guided discussion in a neutral environment, facilitated by an impartial mediator. The mediation to address complex issues may require more than one session. At the end, this option can lead to an enforceable written agreement signed by both parties, but whether there is resolution to the issues or an agreement is created really depends on the participants. The school district must ensure that the representative participating in the mediation has the authority to enter into a binding agreement on behalf of the district. And again, there's no cost to the family or school district to participate in mediation. Mediation can be used for any disagreement. It can be for issues related to eligibility for special education services, transition issues, placement, or communication issues. Mediation can help improve communication and relationships by assisting parties to focus on the specific issues of disagreement and talk through their concerns for the purpose of reaching a mutually agreeable decision. A mediator is trained in mediation techniques and special education law. The mediator sets ground rules, clarifies points of agreement and disagreement, takes notes during the meeting, and works with the parent and school to reach a mutually acceptable resolution to the issues of disagreement. If an agreement is reached, the mediator will record the agreement. The mediator will not make decisions, won't give legal advice, and they won't take sides during the process. Students, parents, or schools can request a meeting facilitator or mediator through special education mediation services, which provides services at no cost to families or schools. SEMS is an Individuals with Disabilities Education Act grant-funded initiative that uses trained mediators and facilitators who are not employees of the Michigan Department of Education, an ISD, or a school district. The IDEA mandates that procedures are in place to allow parties to resolve disagreements through a mediation process. Parties can contact SEMS by phone or fill out a request for services form online. SEMS will gather the needed information about the student, the school, and the issues at hand, and will provide information about how their services may help the situation. SEMS contacts the other party for agreement to participate and will coordinate with the local dispute resolution center to arrange a mutually agreeable date, time, and location to meet. And then SEMS processes all the paperwork and the parties meet together to try to resolve the issues. At the end of the presentation, I have a slide that has some additional resources that aren't necessarily in your handouts. And the information on how to contact SEMS will be in there, the link for their online form and their website. So what if you've met informally, maybe you've used meeting facilitation or mediation, there's still disagreements that can't be resolved. This may be the time that filing a state complaint is considered. A state complaint is a formal option to resolve disagreement. It's a written signed statement that alleges a public agency, such as a school or a school district, violated state or federal rules or regulations related to special education programs and services, violated an intermediate school district plan or the Michigan Revised School Code as related to special education, or a decision made by an administrative law judge or a state application for federal funds. State complaints can be filed for a variety of reasons. These are just some common examples of issues that could be addressed through a state complaint process. Could be related to the IEP. Maybe a student or parent was not invited to the IEP meeting, or the IEP is not being implemented. Maybe goals and objectives are not measurable, or services in the IEP are not written in a clear manner. Could be related to evaluation. Maybe the district didn't respond to a student or parent's written request to evaluate, or the evaluation was not completed in the timeline required. Could be related to discipline. No services were provided for a student who was suspended or expelled, or maybe there wasn't a manifestation determination review that was not done. Could be related to FAPE, that programs and services are not appropriate, or related to records, that districts didn't allow a student or a parent to see or have access to records. Issues, so again, these are just some examples. This list is not exhaustive, but issues previously decided in a due process complaint involving the same parties cannot be investigated through a state complaint. So where can you get additional information about issues that the Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education does not have the authority to investigate? Matters about individual school staff or questions about school or district policies are addressed by the local school district. Students or parents should go up the chain of command in the school district to resolve these issues. They can also reach out to their school board. Issues of discrimination or access to education under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. These complaints are handled by the Office of Civil Rights. Denial of a student or parent's access to records can be addressed through a state complaint, but other matters about student records can be addressed to the Student Privacy Office, U.S. Department of Education. The IDEA contains specific regulations regarding a school district's duty to safeguard student records. Information about confidentiality and access to student records can also be found in the Family Education and Privacy Rights Act. And allegations of abuse or neglect are handled by local law enforcement agency and or child, or in the case of an adult protective services. So anyone can file a state complaint. The person doesn't have to live in Michigan. And the person who files the complaint is called the complainant. We often think of this process as something that students or parents do when they have a dispute with the school, but I have received phone calls from school personnel wanting to know how to file a state complaint. And actually, I worked with a social worker at a charter school who I knew for a long time. So she trusted me to give her accurate information. And she believed that multiple students with IEPs were not receiving the amount of services that were written in their IEPs, and therefore they were being denied FAPE. So I provided her the information and she filed a state complaint on behalf of these students. And the students ultimately were awarded compensatory services to make up for the missed service hours. So there has to be a written release of information that's signed, dated, and submitted to the Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education by the parent or student if the rights have been transferred. So if the student is over 18 and they are making their own educational decisions. If a state complaint is filed by somebody, not the student or parent as defined by IDEA. So that written release is only required if it's not the student or the parent that's filing that state complaint. And this allows the Office of Special Education to communicate with the complainant. If the release is provided, it's not required that they sign that release, but if the release is provided, then all communication regarding that state complaint investigation will go to the student or parent and the non-parent complainant. So whoever that person is that's making the complaint will get the information also. If that release is not provided, the complainant's still able to file the complaint, but the complainant will not receive any communication from the Office of Special Education following the initial letter stating that the complaint has been received and it's going to be investigated. The public agency that the state complaint is filed against is the respondent, and that public agency could include a school district, a charter school or public school academy, an ISD, a RESA, Michigan Department of Education, or any other state agency providing education to students with disabilities. And regardless of whether a state agency receives federal funding, they are still obligated to follow IDEA if they're educating students with disabilities. An individual could file a complaint if he or she believes a public agency violated a special education rule or regulation for an individual student, and they want a remedy called a corrective action for that specific student. A systemic complaint can also be filed if a person or an organization believes a public agency violated a special education rule or regulation for a group of students, or a district-wide policy or procedure violates special education rule or regulation, and they want a school or a district or an ISD corrective action. In order for a state complaint to move forward in the investigation process, there must be a statement that the public agency, as I mentioned, has violated IDEA, MARS, Michigan Revised School Code related to special education programs and services, or failed to implement an IEP, an administrative law judge decision, or an ISD plan, or the state application for federal funds under IDEA. The state complaint must also include the facts on which the statement is based, an allegation that the violation did not occur more than 1 year before the date the complaint is received, and the state complaint must be signed and include the contact information of the complainant. If information is missing, the Office of Special Education may contact the complainant to obtain the missing information, but the complaint is not considered filed until all the required information is received by the Office of Special Education. State complaints about a specific student must also include the student's name and address, the name of the school the student is attending, if the child is homeless, available contact information, and a description of the nature of the problem, including the facts related to the problem and a suggested solution to the problem. The Office of Special Education has a state complaint model form that's in your handouts. You're not required to use the form, but all the required information must be submitted to the Office of Special Education to consider the complaint received. A state complaint must be received by the Office of Special Education within 1 year of the alleged violation. After the complaint is filed, the OS has 60 calendar days to complete the investigation and issue a final decision. The IDEA allows an extension of that timeline for exceptional circumstances or mediation or other informal resolution processes. Extension requests of the 60 calendar days timeline are determined by the OS. Things like staff shortages, heavy caseloads, school vacations and breaks, and use of mediation or dispute resolution without the agreement of both parties don't meet the criteria for exceptional circumstances. When a state complaint contains issues that are part of a due process complaint, the OS will put a temporary hold on any parts of the state complaint being addressed in the due process complaint until the administrative law judge orders a decision. A written state complaint is submitted to the Michigan Department of Education, Office of Special Education. You can do this by mail, email, fax, or hand delivery. In accordance with the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education, if a verbal allegation is made to a school district, the school district must help the person in filling out the state complaint. So let's get into the details of how the state complaint process works. Once the state complaint is determined to have all the necessary information and is considered received, an OS investigator called a case manager will be assigned to the complaint. The OS will conduct the investigation with support from the ISD when the state complaint is filed against one of the schools in the district. The OS case manager and ISD representative gather relevant information used to determine the facts of the case. When the OS determines that there's a conflict of interest involving a school in the ISD, the OS will conduct the investigation without support from the ISD. The next 3 slides are going to give a quick summary of what happens in each step of the state complaint investigation process. Again, there's more detailed information in your handout, the special education state complaints, procedures, and model forms, and it outlines each of these steps in a lot more detail. The first 3 steps include the OS receiving the state complaint, date stamping it, and reviewing it to make sure all required information is included. This is called sufficient. The 60-day calendar day timeline begins when the MDE OS case manager is assigned. If the complaint is not sufficient, meaning there's information that's missing, the OS notifies the complainant of the missing information. When the complaint is determined sufficient, the OS notifies the parties and other relevant individuals. An introduction letter is sent and includes the date of the state complaint, when it was filed, the date the final report is due, and the contact information for the OS case manager. The letter includes the procedural safeguards, part 8 of the MARS, which are the rules about state complaints, a copy of the special education state complaints, procedures, and model forms document, and a special education mediation services brochure. During steps 4 to 6, the OS case manager identifies the issues to be investigated in the state complaint based on the documentation and shares these with the ISD representative for feedback. The issues letter is sent to all parties, including other relevant individuals, which defines the issues to be investigated and requests specific documents needed for the investigation. The public agency has 10 calendar days to provide all requested documentation. Parties may submit relevant information for consideration through day 50 of the investigation. The OS, with support from the ISD representative, will provide an opportunity for the complainant to be interviewed, respond to questionnaires, or submit additional information. The OS will request interviews, completion of questionnaires, and gathering of additional information from relevant staff of the public agency. The OS case manager will review data and consider all information received and determine whether additional information is needed. When the above steps are completed, the OS case manager composes a draft report containing the issues, a description of the investigation process, documents that are reviewed, individuals who were interviewed, findings of fact, conclusions, proposed decisions, and when applicable, proposed corrective action. During the final steps of the state complaint investigation process, the OS does an internal review of the draft final decision, including review by the supervisor of the OS program accountability unit. Draft findings of fact are shared with the ISD representative for review only. OS case manager will consult with the ISD representative to discuss conclusions, proposed decisions, and when applicable, propose corrective action. And then the OS prepares MDE's final decision of the state complaint. The OS sends MDE the final decision to the parties and other relevant individuals, and the OS notifies the complainant by email or phone that MDE's final decision has been issued. The OS does the investigative work, but the final decision is issued by the Michigan Department of Education. The final decision includes an introduction, including relevant time period for the investigation, the identified issues, the description of the interview process, federal regulations or state rules applicable to the issues, findings of fact, conclusions, the decision, and when applicable, corrective action. If there's no violation by the public agency, the case is closed. If there's violation by the public agency, corrective action is ordered. There are still options available after filing a state complaint. Parties have the option to resolve the issues through mediation at any time during the state complaint process. Following mediation, the state complaint, all or a portion of it, may be withdrawn through a specified agreement or in a separate request from the complainant. The complainant can withdraw a state complaint at any time during the 60 calendar day investigation for any reason by submitting a written request to the OS to withdraw the complaint. And a portion or all of the state complaint can be dismissed by the OS when issues raised in the complaint are resolved through a due process complaint final order issued by an administrative law judge. A final decision issued by the Michigan Department of Education is final. While the IDEA allows for a state to establish a state level appeal process, the entire process would be required to be conducted within the 60 calendar days timeline. The Michigan Department of Education utilizes the 60 calendar days timeline to ensure that a comprehensive state complaint investigation is completed within that allotted time. Therefore, no administrative appeal or reconsideration requests are allowed. When a violation by the public agency is identified, the OS will order corrective action that is specific to the violation and intended to ensure future compliance for all students with disabilities within the public agency and to correct the non-compliance for an individual student. Some examples of corrective action at the school, the district, or the ISD level could be reviewing, and if necessary, revising procedures, providing staff training, or informing the Board of Education when persistent non-compliance occurs. Corrective action for an individual student could include conducting an evaluation, convening an IEP team meeting, developing a behavior intervention plan, or awarding compensatory education services, which are special education related services owed to the student when the public agency failed to provide services in accordance with the student's IEP. The IDEA requires the non-compliance to be corrected as soon as possible, but not later than 1 year after the final decision is issued. The OS and the ISD monitor and verify progress of completion of corrective action before closing out the state complaint, including a review of the documentation submitted, random selection of special education files, and/or staff interviews. Student level corrective action must be completed within 30 school days unless specified in the state complaint final decision, including a plan for providing compensatory services. Compensatory services awarded to an individual student must be provided as soon as possible, but no later than 1 year after the final order is issued. So I've included, as I mentioned, a lot of information in your participant handouts, but these are just some additional resources that I thought might be helpful to you. If you're not familiar with it, the Michigan Department of Education Office of Special Education Information Line is a great resource for questions related to special education, Section 504 topics. The information line is for families, educators, and anybody who has any questions. And there are, every month they get multiple calls from educators. So it's families are calling, but a lot of educators are calling too. It's a great resource for information. Family Matters is a resource page with one-page fact sheets developed by the Office of Special Education for parents and families, but these fact sheets are available to anyone who needs the information. And they have fact sheets on all kinds of topics, special education services and dispute resolution and IEPs and mediation and facilitation, a lot of the topics that I talked about today. This is the information for special education mediation services, the website and the link. And again, this is, you'll get the PowerPoint with this link in there and the online request for services form. Excuse me. And then in case you're not familiar, just so you know, Disability Rights Michigan is a private nonprofit, nonpartisan protection and advocacy organization authorized by federal and state law to advocate and protect the rights of people with disabilities in Michigan. And this is their website information, and they also have an online request form. And again, it's not just for families and parents, it's for anybody who has a concern about a child or an adult with a disability where they might have their rights violated. Our comprehensive website includes up-to-date information and resources about disability-specific topics, links to our recorded videos, and information about how you can sign up for our monthly e-newsletter. We share information on social media and offer statewide virtual events and learning opportunities throughout the year. And our materials and events are always free to participants, caregivers, and educators. Michigan Alliance for Families' greatest asset is our regional parent mentors and information referral staff around the state. And they are here and ready to help families and professionals. The regional parent mentors provide individualized assistance about special education and related services. If you want to know who the regional parent mentor is that covers your area, you can go to the About Us tab on the website. And you can call the number 800-552-4821. I think it was on either the slide before or the slide after. And then when you call that number, that's the 800 number, but it automatically geo-routes you to the regional parent mentor in your area. So if you need the information for yourself that you want to talk to a regional parent mentor, or if you have a student or a parent who needs that individualized assistance, you can refer them there as well. Just our last slides that we put in. Patrick, can you put in the link to our survey? We do have to report back to our funders, but more importantly, we really appreciate your feedback. It helps us to improve what we do, and Patrick is putting a link to the survey in the chat, and it's just a very short survey. So if you would please give feedback on this presentation. We really appreciate it, and it really does help us improve what we do. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And now it's time for the quiz. And no, I so much appreciate this. This is dense information, but it's very important information. And so we had a couple of questions that we had sent Michelle ahead of time, just from some continuing ongoing conversations. We do have time for questions if anyone would like to put those in the chat, or you can just say, I have a question, and then we'll circle to you and allow you to unmute and do that. But wanted to start the conversation, Michelle, in terms of looking at our individual programs and districts. What are some recommendations that you see from your vantage point that programs and districts need to ensure that they're implementing so that they can be in compliance with IEP services and requests?
So the beginning, I guess I'm going to answer questions kind of generally, and I normally don't work directly with families, but I've asked Patrick to share my email address. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to take those. Generally, my work is with the parent mentors and the advocates and the Office of Special Education. I don't get a whole lot of outside questions in this role from other entities, but I am happy to answer any follow-up questions that you may have. So I guess the easy, quick answer is follow the laws and the rules, but I always go back to discussing the student needs. It all starts with, what do the students that you're working with, what are their needs? And talking to students and their parents, I'm going to use both, about what their concerns are. And all of this, so all the questions that Patrick sent me, I kind of am starting with, it's all about relationship building, those collaborative conversations about what works for the student and what does the student need. Those, they break down when parents feel or students feel unheard. So I'm kind of putting my advocacy hat on now, because that is where a lot of my work did. And I did a lot of work with families and schools in working on those collaborative relationships. I know advocates sometimes get a bad rap. I've heard all the stories, but my approach was always collaborative, because that's when the real progress was made. So how do, like addressing IEP requests and staying in compliance, it's about listening to what the concerns are for the students and the families, and talking about what the students' needs are, how to address those. There's not always one right way, because a parent suggests or a student suggests that an accommodation be added into their IEP does not necessarily mean that's the only way. I would get calls all the time for parents asking for a parapro. That was kind of the thing they wanted. You know, my student's struggling, he needs a parapro or she needs a parapro. And that wasn't always what was needed. We had to back up to what the student needs were and talk about how can you support the student. So that's kind of my quick answer to this is follow the laws and the rules, know the laws and the rules, use the dispute resolution options. Not everything has to go from 0 to 100. There are a lot of things like mediation and meeting facilitation and informal meetings where parents can come together. And also, I think if the best meetings that I attended were where each party understood the concerns and the issues of the other side. So parents don't, and students, older students don't always understand the struggles on the side of the schools, staff shortages and limited resources. They don't often think or understand those. So if school personnel can share those concerns, not using it as an excuse, but just explaining this is what it is, and we really need to work harder together to come up with solutions and resolutions, those are the starting points.
That's a great segue, Michelle, into the second question around, could you talk a little bit about appropriate accommodations? Certainly, especially in when we look at adult education programs, as with all of education, we look at the funding resources and structures that are available. And oftentimes in adult education, a lot of those services are limited for individualized support as it relates to meeting some requirements or accommodations. And so I know that administrators and teachers often try to balance that responsibility with, as you kind of alluded to, a little bit of the staffing challenges or maybe not having the financial resources, especially on the adult education side. Could you talk a little bit about how that process works or what those conversations could look like with families as you're going through that process for appropriate accommodations?
So I just want to start by saying that in IDEA, there's no, that terminology of appropriate reasonable accommodation is not used. It starts with the student needs. So in Section 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act, they talk about reasonable and appropriate accommodations. That terminology is used, and there's some language in there, but again, it's very individualized and it depends on a lot of factors. So students under Section 504 and under IDEA are entitled to FAPE, and FAPE is individualized. It's based on the student's disability. Evaluations and data and accommodations depend on the student's identified needs. So under IDEA, a school must develop an IEP that meets all of the needs of the student with a disability in order for the student to receive FAPE. So it's not just the eligibility category that student is eligible for special education services under, it's all of their identified needs. So again, I'm going to keep going back to it's those conversations. There's not only one right way. There's not only one accommodation that may work for that student. It's having those conversations with the student, if they're as an adult, the parent, and the school, and coming together. And often with teams I worked with, I know everybody hates meetings. We're so tired of, especially virtual ones. I don't think I got this, it didn't seem this hard when we were in person, but virtually, it's everybody's done. But sometimes we had to set up regular meetings. We set up monthly meetings because issues we needed, accommodations were implemented, and you needed time to see if things would work. And then maybe they weren't working. And so the team had to come back to the table. So it's the commitment on all sides to have those ongoing conversations. And I guess, again, from my advocacy perspective, collaborating and understanding that there's not only one right way to provide that support to that student, and being open. sometimes, I mean, I'll tell you from my advocacy perspective that sometimes school personnel were not very open to parents' questions and concerns and ideas. A parent might suggest something and it was immediately pushed aside and no, we can't do it. Rather than talking about, well, maybe we can't do it in the way you're asking, but how can we think about this to meet that student's needs? Can we tweak this? Is there something different that we can do? So it really starts with those meaningful conversations and everybody coming in with the student's best interest in mind, of course, and that honest effort, like really coming in from a place of wanting to work together.
Appreciate that, Michelle. And I'm going to kind of tie in these two questions here. You know, that 18 to 26 population is so important. And oftentimes the adult education system, because now it is really set up in a regional model, there may be an individual that is enrolled in an adult education program in a different district or a different program that is not their primary district of residence. And so how, this is very general, but how would you broach some of those conversations, both from the adult education staff perspective, as well as the district of residence or the ISD district of residence perspective about coming to the table to talk about how to better coordinate some of those services and what that could look like? You've talked a little bit about that, but I just wonder if there's anything else you might add to that.
I mean, for me, that it's again, it's about that collaboration. It's about really, it's wanting to collaborate. I mean, I worked with some school teams that I sat around the table with 15 other people, you know, me and the parent and the other 13 school personnel. And I could tell who was vested in that student's success and who maybe wasn't all in. And so it's an attitude. It's that collaboration. It's really wanting to work together. I mean, I see those conversations, not that the conversation itself is easy, but I see that process is easy. Somebody has to take the lead though. They can't, you know, everybody is busy, but somebody has to take the lead on reaching out and getting those important team members to the table. And again, you know, as you mentioned in your very beginning of the introduction, what is the district's responsibility and holding them to that responsibility. At the same time, keeping that collaborative tone in wanting to come to the resolution of addressing that student's needs and understanding that just because you as a school maybe have done something a certain way for however long, that's not necessarily the only way to approach that situation.
There are a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to get to, and Whitney and Matt, if you want to unmute and add to it as well. But Whitney was asking, will any of those resources help with over age 26? So Whitney, were you referring to some of the ones that from the Michigan Alliance for Families? I want to make sure we clarify that.
Yeah, like the additional resources that were listed, some of the phone numbers.
The resources I provided for this presentation are specifically related to, like in the handouts and stuff, that's specifically related to students to 26 receiving special education services. But like Disability Rights Michigan, they are a resource for children and adults no matter how old. And our website, we do have a lot. If you go to our, and I'm sorry, if you go to MichiganAllianceForFamilies.org and you just in the search box put transition, we have links to adult services, adult resources. We have partner agencies that work with adult, community mental health agencies. So there's a lot of over 26 we have information about transition and employment, and there's links on the website to those resources on those web pages. I mean, we have a very comprehensive website if you haven't looked at it, and it's constantly being updated. It's being reviewed. It's always reviewed by Michigan Department of Education, Office of Special Education. That we have a joint review process with our team so that everything is up to date. All of the information is accurate and the most current and reputable sources. So there's a lot of information about students transitioning into employment and independent living and community life. We have information about person-centered planning and self-determination. So there's a lot of resources for not just school resources, other adult services as well.
Whitney is appreciative of that, as I know others are in the comments, Michelle. And Matt had a question. And Matt, you can certainly unmute if you want to add anything more to that, because I know sometimes typing out our questions is, we can't capture it all in a simple sentence. But he was asking if you could elaborate a little more on the difference between FAPE under IDEA and FAPE under 504.
Well, I'm not sure so free, appropriate public education in meeting the students' needs. I'm not exactly sure. So there, so under special education, so section 504 it's a civil rights. It's about access to services and access to education. Is it a specific question about like a section?
No, Michelle, it just when you started to answer earlier, you began your answer talking about FAPE under IDEA, and it includes this, and it includes that. It doesn't include this, or it doesn't include that. And then we never heard anything about what FAPE under 504 is. So I was just looking for the good of this audience, because I don't recognize many names in the group here. I'm guessing this is by and large, this is not a special ed a group of folks, right, who dig deep in the weeds all the time. So just trying to looking for a little closure on that loop. We talked a little bit about about FAPE under IDEA. What's the difference? What does it look like under 504?
So it's about access. It's about access to education. Whereas FAPE under IDEA is about could be about individualized special education services. I mean, services can be provided under section 504. So in general terms, if a student with a section 504 plan needs social work services, then those can definitely be identified in the 504 plan. There's not a limit on services. There's not a limit on accommodations. Section 504 addresses access to education. Special education services are for individuals who need more individualized, specialized services, I guess, is in a nutshell. Does that answer it?
Yeah, I think that does a nice job of distinguishing that 504 is really about equitable access to the educational environment, which includes curriculum and instruction, right? That's equitable access. And IDEA is really about the individualized, specialized instructional supports and services that a student needs in order to make progress and realize some kind of an equitable outcome from their educational experience.
Right. And I know that I often heard from school personnel who were not aware that under section 504, students could still receive services. They could still receive social work services or psychological services. They felt like it was only accommodations. So the only thing that they wanted to do was put accommodations in the plan, and that's where it stopped. But that's not the case, as you mentioned. It's about what the student needs for that access to education.
Well, thank you, Michelle. We so appreciate starting us on this kind of 30,000 overview. And we're going to be drilling down. And again, we could have a whole this is a decades-long conversation, right? I mean, this is not a new topic, unfortunately, but we're here today, and I think we were talking earlier about how many of these challenges have only been exacerbated by the pandemic, and many of the longstanding barriers that these populations have been facing have only been amplified and magnified. And so I just appreciate you kind of laying that groundwork and the context and all the helpful resources as we kind of continue to navigate this and think about these things. And I just think from a policy perspective as well, it might be good to include your voice on that FAPE adult and special education work group that the department has put together, or others like you, because I think that might help move the needle a little bit. And so just from a member of that committee, I think maybe having some other voices at the table might help to move that conversation forward. So thank you so much, Michelle, for your time, and we so appreciate. And I would encourage everyone to go into the chat, I'll repost it as well, and to complete that quick survey on behalf of the Michigan Alliance for Families. So thank you so much, Michelle, for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we're going to transition now to Mr. Oogie Lamar at the Kent ISD, Director of Adult Education there. And I'm going to quickly share my screen here. Oogie is a longstanding member of our association and has worked as 9 years as Director of Adult Ed at the Wyoming Public Schools before transitioning to the Kent ISD. He has prior administrative experience in the Wyoming Public Schools District, serving as a middle school principal and alternative high school dean of students. And he also served as a college administrator at Grand Valley State, go Lakers, Central Michigan, go Chips, got to get that in there for Oogie, and Aquinas College as well. And he serves not only on the board of McKay, but also as a board member of Head Start for Kent County as a past president, the CMU Alumni Board, and the West Michigan Literacy Center Advisory Council. And so I'll leave Oogie to kind of give a little context and background, but just wanted to add before I turn it over to him that as one of the largest providers of adult education in the state, he has been a critical voice in working through this complaint issue as it relates to special education for adult education participants, and really activated his network within the Kent County ISD and working with local school districts to really forge and create a template that is being implemented. So that's why we invited Oogie to share that perspective with us today. So take it over, Oogie.
Thank you, Patrick. I think I have to update my bio there a little bit. Some of the things that I did with the Literacy Center is a couple years old and working with them, but still active in the area, working and trying to do as much as I can to provide some support for adult education and literacy services over here on the West Side. I just want to thank you, Patrick and Whitney, for giving me the opportunity to come in and share, like you said, at the ground level, what happens in this process and ways that we can improve our services to make sure that they're inclusive and that the rights afforded to our students with special ed services are taken care of. And I want to thank Michelle for going through all of the acronyms and things that will follow in some of the slides that I have. But I am very, very lucky. I'm very fortunate to be an employee of the ISD. And so for a lot of the remedies that we have, I have access to those folks. I meet with them monthly. They're elbow partners with me quite often that could have real easy conversations about things that we do and providing access to participants in our program. Whitney, I want to say thank you for asking that question about the 26-year-olds. And I think that's where we were in violation and the state complaint happened to Kent ISD. And it was a question that I answered for a 24-year-old who, for some reason, I answered as if they were 27-year-old. So we did have a state complaint that came to us. It was from an outside agency. It was not specific to a student that we had, but it was more procedural or policy wise. And so, again, I was able to access the folks at the ISD to help us through that and guide our future interactions with our students. So what I want to do is share my screen. It's up there, everyone can see that? Yep, okay. And so for the KNIC, we did have to respond to an MDE state complaint. And I want to bring you through what we did at the program level to make sure that that complaint was and our corrective action plan was in place. But before we start that, a little bit of fun. It is the last Friday of Black History Month. And so I want to thank everyone for celebrating and honoring Black history. And as we transition into March is both Reading Month and Women's History Month. And so I want to take just a minute. I always have some technical issues, so fingers crossed, just to share with you some of the great things that women have done.
Women that have gone before me and have taken to the sky.
There's a need for women in faith.
Well, is there a need for men in faith?
All these women have been my role models and my inspiration, and I couldn't be here today without them.
Özlem Türeci is the woman behind a leading COVID-19 vaccine.
Women bringing energy to rap that did not exist before. And the Grammy goes to Cardi B.
Who knows how many others could have been the first if they'd had the chance to try.
Pattern Beauty is launching. I'm the first person in my family to start a business.
Let's talk about some glass ceilings being shattered.
Judo to buy summit heights no woman before her had reached.
We can show girls that anything is possible. It doesn't matter what they look like or where they come from. They can change the world.
So again, I just want to thank all of the women for the work that they've done. And as a proud father of two young girls, look and see some of the things that they'll be able to accomplish.
For those who don't know me, my name is Mei. For those who know me, my name is still Mei.
Let's see. Sorry. But let me go on and share again what we did. We had to go through for the KNISD and look at our child find process and how we work and identify students with disabilities. And so we started with a meeting with our director of special education, our assistant superintendent of special education for the KNISD. We went through an introduction of the child find process. We had to go through and have corrective action completed. A lot of it was in a review of our enrollment process, and we'll go through that and I'll show you how we have changed some things that way. Our staff needed access to actually be able to go through and complete those procedures within Child Find. Had a lot of times discussing what we would do, and then they were able to have some time for us to ask questions as we went through. And so again, there was a state complaint that was filed against us, again, regarding more policy versus actually what we did. It was, again, not a specific student that went through, but more of a procedural things that we do. And so what we came up with, again, is all districts must have a policy and procedures in place to enact their child find obligation. And that obligation, again, at our level, at the ground level, is to locate, identify, and evaluate all students with disabilities specifically in adult education programs. I think Michelle had referred to this piece of legislation a little bit earlier. And we weren't doing that. We weren't able to really properly go through and identify, locate, and evaluate those students. And so for our required action, corrective action, the district must develop procedures regarding the child find and to document and ensure that the child find policies and procedures are in place for all individuals birth to 26 who have and are suspected of having disabilities. And so I'll show you a little bit as we go through. We changed some of our policies before when we had written ALPs as students went in. They may not check that box that said that they had an IEP. They kind of went over it maybe through not wanting to share that information with us, but as we transitioned to an electronic version, it was a must-fill part of what they did when they filled out their IEP or their ALP. And so they couldn't skip over those things anymore. And so we did know and have a little bit of an increase in folks that were identifying with special education services. And it also, our teachers had some suspicions, or if folks had IEPs or not, or needed those services, we had to work with them too. So the ISD collaborated with our resident districts to ensure the child find obligation with respect to the students enrolled in the adult education program is identified and enacted. We were very, very fortunate. Again, for us, the key to all of that was being able to connect and build those relationships with the special ed directors. And so our assistant superintendent for special education met with all the directors during their monthly meetings and reminded them of their obligation as a LEA, that it was up to them to provide those services to folks that are up to the age of 26. The students that are over the age of 26 that may need a diagnosis found. We worked with Michigan Rehabilitative Services to provide some of those services for the adults that were over age, but it was really easy for us, again, led by our special ed director, to provide those services. These are some of the changes that we made. Our records request was one thing that we found out that did not fit what we needed to have. And so here's a copy of our updated records request. Just a general part of it. I think a lot of folks may look the same way. But really what was changed for us was this section right here that says, I have read and understood this consent, or had it read to me in the language that I understand, and I hereby authorize the release of the above information to the Ken ISD Adult Education, and authorize the Ken ISD Adult Education to engage in two-way communication. That was part of the missing part that we had before. Before we would just have them send us our records, but we are now able to actually call, follow up with those LEAs and really speak to anybody within those LEAs about students and their special education services that they needed. So that was one thing that we had to do. And as far as our enrollment records itself, we came up with a policy. I can make this a little bit bigger. And procedures that we had to follow. And I'll go through this. It's kind of lengthy. I think our time's getting kind of close at the end. But every member's district in the Ken ISD has shared responsibility and obligation to identify, locate, and evaluate students with disabilities from age birth to 26. It goes over the FAPE part of what Matt had brought up and what Michelle had brought up a little bit earlier. Students attending the Ken ISD secondary adult education program may be eligible for special education programs if they're under the age of 26. Another part that is in here that was important, point number 2, have not graduated with a regular high school diploma. We see a lot of students with their certificates of completion. They are still eligible for our services, which does not include even the GED. And so students beyond their GED are eligible to receive additional services. It addresses IDA, but really I think the part that may be valuable, and again, I'll share this with everyone else, is we develop kind of a little flow chart of how we will work with students as they come in. And so we've kind of had 3 different tracks for students. And so
you could take your Oogie, you could take your time because we are recording. So if we have to,
okay,
if people have to bow out at 10:30, we'll get them the recording that they need.
Let me go up a little bit then. Sorry, Patrick. And so we have a section here that covers FAPE, students attending again, our programs under the age of 26, whether a regular high school diploma. Again, it does not include the GED, or it does not include anyone that has a certificate of completion. We address some things under IDA in this document. Can I see adult education child find procedures? And if you're not familiar with it, really for us, it is, we now every other week, if I can run it every week, run every student through our database. And so currently we have a little over 1,100 students enrolled in our program. Our registrar has access, our social workers have access to make sure that we did not miss any students. So we run bi-weekly our lists of enrollment through Child Find and make sure that we did not miss a student. And so that was part of our procedures that were maybe not handled as well as we should have in the past. We really relied on the services or the students going through and self-identifying. And so in this procedure, in our corrective action, we do that, let's say bi-weekly. Can I see adult education contacts a district of residents with consent in the release form that I showed you of information on the release of information document in MIPSI. If a release is not obtained, it notifies the students of his or her parents. For us, again, we know that our 98% of our students are over the age of 18. And so if we, in this document, if we put parent, it's usually the student who is the one who's able to do that. Again, it goes on some of the legal things that we have within 10 days. And I think Michelle had covered a lot of these procedures. I'm glad as I sat there and watched and listened to a lot of the things that she had. We do have those timelines, those procedures, those policies written within this document, again, which is our corrective action plan. Again, the timelines, 10 days from when they write it, 30 days following that eligibility and things that we have to do. Matt had said again, and we had a little bit of discussion about 504s and their differences there. That is included in this document as we go through. But this is what we kind of looked at as a flow chart. What would we do if a student walked in the door, and how would we refer them? What would be the follow-up and the student's options? So I'm glad to say that we advocate for student rights. I think a big thing for us is also helping them to understand and learn their rights that they have. Quite often when we're sitting with students that come in with special education services, they may not be up to date to some of the things that they were not given or some of the obligations that they had in the K-12 system. And so I'll bring you down the left side of the page of what we do when students come in. They have kind of 3 tracks that we've had for them. An adult can either come in, they sign their release of information. And again, that is part of that intake and request for records form that we have. And the student determines the desire to continue with the district of resident with their IEP. If that were to happen, the Ken ISD Adult Education Program will locate the student in MIPSI. That's important. And having conversations with other adult ed programs, getting access to MIPSI has been challenging for some. Usually that's run through their special ed director. I know with some of our smaller programs, they may not have that access, but that's something that is very important that, again, we're able to do that in a timely manner. The Ken ISD Adult Education staff will search for special education eligibility for all enrollees under the age of 26. Ken ISD Adult Education staff communicates with the districts of residence for evaluation and for the IEP program services and to coordinate on student accommodation needs within the adult education program. I would say since this corrective action plan has happened with us, we have had way more interaction with our member districts. In Kent County, we have 23 different districts that we can work through. So it is a lot of folks that we have communication with. They've been very supportive in the sense that we have some students that are blind. And we needed, and they are required to have some of our information translated into Braille. And so that's just one example of what the LEA has done for us. Our students still attend our program, but all of our documents his work is done and translated into Braille. Something, again, that we could not afford to do as an adult ed program without the collaboration and support of our locals. The second track here, adults does not sign the release of information and or declines options for special education. And with this case, a prior written notice would be provided by the Ken ISD Adult Education that provides ready, willing, and able statement to communicate with the district of residence through the release of based on the student's eligibility and entitlement to the age of 26. So if the student declines special education and a prior written notice is provided, then the student enrolls without communication with the district of residence and the services. So then we just stop there. So that's that second track. Third track, student comes in, adult does not sign the release of information and requests to revoke their rights and eligibility, which would be completed through the revocation of consent and cessation of services. So that's another thing, again, as we go through, run students through Child Find, find out that a student has and is eligible for services, and they decide just to revoke their services. We have to have that revocation consent form signed. We place that in their CA-60. The student is able to come into our program, but would enroll without those services being provided for them. So they're able to have all those choices. Again, we are pretty aggressive in the search for those students. That was something that we had to do, and make sure that the students has their rights and know what is they're eligible for. So any questions about this process at all right now, or?
Yes, I have one. It's Mike O'Connor.
Yes, Mike.
And this is for any of you, Matt or Michelle also. If a student decides to go that route, the third route there, and opt out of, and the parents agree to opt out of special education services, what benefits in terms of MRS or SSI benefits do they lose? What's the risk factor there, or any other benefits that they may lose?
I think it's high risk. I don't like it. It's the last piece of advice that I give to folks, Mike. I
realize that, but some students, they just want to opt for that period. You can't talk them out of it. So even with the consequences. So I'm just asking, what are some of the things they risk losing?
That's a good question, Mike. And actually, timing is everything, right? We are meeting, some of us on the McKay board, with the Michigan Rehabilitative Services on Thursday of next week, and I can raise that question in a, I think it'd be helpful to get a formal written response that we could certainly share out, because I think that there's in some initial, I had a similar question in some initial conversations with them. The answer is a little convoluted. And so I think in terms of eligibility, just like for adult education services, there are certain eligibility criteria that they look at to have someone enroll in those services. And the answer was, it could potentially impact their eligibility in certain enrollment within the MRS system. So what I think would be helpful is if I circle back and get a more formal response that's
Okay,
written to
yeah.
circle back to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I know I've asked different people in special ed the same thing, and it's hard to get an answer. And it almost boils down to individual cases and contacting the service providers from where they're receiving services. Just a comment also earlier in this segment, Matt and Michelle were talking about 504s as opposed to IEPs. I know in the past, having sat on in several meetings for IEP meetings with parents and staff and everybody as the administrative representative, often they'll go for the 504 because they don't want the stigma of an IEP and their child being in special education. For that reason, some parents won't sign, but they prefer a 504. It's not really a trail, if you will, follow them.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of subjective feelings oftentimes during this process on the part of especially as we start to, like what you alluded to, Mike, when we start to look at adults that are making decisions about their own educational outcomes, and maybe they don't have a support system around them as well, and making those considerations without maybe understanding the full implications and the full processes of everything as well. So I appreciated that comment. Oogie, there was another comment I want to circle back to, because you and I have talked about this extensively from Anne about MIPSV. And I know that is that a Kent ISD specific
database?
Yes. Tool creation. You know,
I'm not sure if that's statewide, but that is where everything is stored. I don't specifically access MIPSI, but we're fortunate to have, or I'm fortunate to have, full-time social workers that have access to that. And our staff, Jamie Grundyke, who's our registrar, has access to that. I know within Kent County, we share some databases and some information. So we're able to look within Kent, Ottawa, and I think Muskegon County may share that database. But yeah, that's a statewide database. I'm sure the MI is the Michigan part of it, special education database there. But that was, I think, a challenge for some other folks to have access to it. But again, with my elbow partner being the person who runs it, assistant soup for special ed in Kent County, and this complaint being there, we knew that was something that would be helpful for our staff to be able to access that.
And Matt, I see your hand up in just a second. I'll circle to you. And Lori, I see you have another question as well. And I'll circle back to that too, because I think that one is going to take a little bit of conversation. But Anne, again, these are great questions, but I think of multiple answers. So Anne's asking, and Oogie, you can talk about this as well from your perspective. What happens if IEP documentation to GED testing services is submitted? You know, the participant submits that for an accommodation, and that accommodation is denied. I'll let you kind of give your experience in that, and then I've got some things to share as well.
I don't think that we've ever really had one that was denied. I think as we've gone through and built again those relationships with GED testing services, with, you know, as we're a testing center with Pearson VUE, I don't think I'm aware of one time that that an accommodation was denied. As we've gone through that, again, we've had several students this year. I think we have identified nearly 100 students this year in our program alone that are eligible for special ed services or some sort of accommodation. So again, I think it's been that relationship, being able to have the proper documents as we've gone through and submitted them. But we've had 0 times that it's been denied.
And I want to add something to that, Oogie. So a little plug for the McKay Spring Institute. We do have a session from GED Testing Services specifically talking about the accommodations for GED testing services. But I can say very generally, in preparation for that presentation, I talked extensively with GED Testing Services. And as a part of that presentation, and I'm sure that we could share that information out more broadly as well post the presentation, they are going to be highlighting why there are perhaps denials or what is the rationale or on behalf of GED Testing Services for not accepting certain documentation. I'll just, not that I feel that I need to defend GED Testing Services, but in those conversations, what has come up is that oftentimes they don't have enough detail or documentation that would support the need for an accommodation. That's a very general statement, but that was one of them. The details was that perhaps the documentation is outdated. It's not recent. Perhaps the documentation doesn't specifically address or give an example for why that particular accommodation is necessary. It is not really supportive to that accommodation. Another thing that Melissa Holstrand and I talked about was that when you are submitting a documentation, it's the different types of documentation that you're submitting. So it may need some rationale or formal. I'll give an example. Is she said that oftentimes there are letters that are submitted that don't have any accompanying clarifying material on who it is coming from, who is the authority that is providing that documentation or supportive material. So whether that's somebody just is supplying a Word document that has no letterhead or no signature or no sign off for any of those people, it really, in those conversations, there was explanation about those being the parameters of why something would be denied, and that there is still a process then for an appeal. So it isn't that that process is totally done. Now, in the programmatic sense, that's a pain in the butt because now you as a staff have to work with that participant to help work through that process. So I want to acknowledge that as well. But those were really kind of the general considerations that came up. So Ann, I'm going to push you to that session, Ann, to we'll get you that material.
And Patrick, Ann has a note in there that says that she had one recently denied from an IEP from a nearby district. I have 2 people that are full-time working to support students that way. And so I think that for us, as we go through, they're very, very thorough. They make sure that they have the proper documents. If they don't have them, again, that's when we're able to have that communication with the LEA or with MRS. It hasn't been immediate. I think at times we make sure that those documents are the correct documents as we collect them. That may mean if it's a 27-year-old who has an outdated IEP, that they revisit a physician or they revisit a psychologist, and then it is done. And so maybe on that sense, we've provided the proper documentation that supports it, or have the knowledge and sitting with someone who would not get an accommodation for whatever reason, that we can kind of determine some of those asks on the front side of it. I think that's why we've just been very successful on that side. I see Mike has his hand up there. Matt, I want to say thank you for adding in there that MIPSI is really our local thing that interacts with Power School, and that's how we have that access to student records and student databases that way. But Mike, did you have another question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. One of the things we're working through, which has some clouded issues, hasn't quite been worked out yet. Students in the Young Adult Services Program, which most districts have, and often they have a certificate of completion, but if they're 18 through age 26, some will say that, well, you can't really put in their IEP that they're going to work on a GED in our adult ed program. But the question is, can they be involved? Can they be enrolled in both YAS, Young Adult Services, and also in adult education to work on their GED, but still receive, in other words, dual enrolled?
Yes, we have some students that are that way, and maybe again for us, Mike, they're enrolled that way, and if they needed to be on the other side of them, we would still allow them to come in and get services for us. They may not be on a roster per se, but we would work and with their LEA to provide those services. We have one student who comes 2 days a week with us and is 3 days in his member district. That's just after discussions that we've had with their LEA. And so really, I think that meeting when we sit down with all parties that are involved, we come up with those type of unique situations or win-wins for everyone as we go through it.
See, one of the people in special ed has told me that if you put in the student's IEP that they are to receive GED services, then automatically they have to transition over to adult education to receive services. They become an adult ed student rather than K-12 YAS student. I don't see why they can't be dual enrolled. And I'm not even asking to take any money if they want to claim them for a full FTE or something, wherever that number is. That's fine. I'm not even looking for that.
Yeah, we just provide services, on that one side of it. We have probably the same type of understanding and support that we want to just make sure that the needs of those students are met. And that's really happened through, like I said, a lot of collaboration through, I think we're working maybe with about 6 or 7 different school districts right now in Kent County. So it's been, again, supported at the ISD level, communicated to all of those other directors that we need to collaborate. And for us, again, it's just been, kind of easy for us to do that.
Yeah, because for some of those students, it's really more appropriate for them to get a GED, and they can also enroll in our special programs, CTE classes. At least they get a certificate and they come out of there at the age of 26 or whatever age under that. When they complete it, at least they have some type of a marketable skill. Whereas if they just stay in YAS, they end up with no terminal certificate that really does them any good and go to a job interview or be self-sustaining.
More conversation on that, Mike. I wrote that down. I don't know what the answer is either. But it's important. I don't know that we've got the right minds that I've been working on that as well. Is that the good response?
Yeah.
But we should. We need to talk about that.
The cracks, but anyhow, thank you. We can talk about that again.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then let's circle to Matt and then end on Lori's softball question. And I say that tongue in cheek.
Patrick, thanks a lot. I kind of wandered into this thing by accident. And so I appreciate you giving me a little bit of
we all did that.
Little bit of space here, right?
Appreciate you being here.
I wanted to circle back to the question earlier. If a student revokes their consent for special ed, how does that impact SSI, SSD, and or adult community-based services, whether it's through MRS or CMH or someone else? The simple answer that gets thorny pretty quick is it really shouldn't. The revocation of special education should only directly impact the provision of special ed, because that's what it's about. It's not about revoking consent for receipt of SSI, SSD. It's not about revoking consent for MRS services. Where it could have a secondary impact, if that's maybe the right way to say it, is if one of those agencies has used the student's status as a student eligible for special education in their own eligibility processes, because you still have to be eligible and qualify for MRS through their own process. You still have to be eligible for and qualify for SSI or SSD through their own process. So if they have used the student's status as a student eligible for special education in part of their own eligibility determination, a student who revokes consent might have to go through some extra steps, right? But revocation of consent for special ed doesn't erase the disability. It simply might have to be established through some other process, and both MRS and the SSI, SSD offices should have those in place. The other question, Mike, that you were just asking about students being, I'm going to use a different phrase, co-enrolled, because dual enrollment has some meaning for high school students who are taking college classes, right?
Right.
So I think you're absolutely right. There's no reason that a student couldn't be co-enrolled simultaneously in an adult ed program pursuing a GED and some kind of a, depending on what part of the state you're in, some folks still call them post-secondary special eds. You know, over in Oakland County, we call them our adult transition programs and services. The nuance, of course, is if you're right in the IEP that the student is going to pursue a GED through something, then you're making the provision of that part of FAPE. And then you have to make sure that as a part of FAPE, you're attending to all of the things that come along with the provision of FAPE. If the student is simply walking out of your K-12 public ed system and in through the adult ed door for part of the day, and then they're coming back into your adult, your young adult program for part of the day, there's a separation there that personally I like. It makes things a little cleaner, knowing who's responsible for what under what circumstances. But what you're really getting at is some of the thorniness that state work group is trying to deal with in terms of adult ed. You know, an IDEA defines adult ed as a post-school activity, which defines it outside of the umbrella of IDEA. Now, how do these things interact? Because in Oakland County, all of our adult ed programs are operated through our local school districts, which is different than Oogie's situation in Kent, where the adult education program is operated by the ISD. So there's some pieces that come together there, but our laws don't necessarily address how they're supposed to come together and who's supposed to do what and when, and that's what that work group is working on.
Well, one of the ways I found around it, I've suggested to a couple of folks at YAS, rather than write the term GED specifically in their IEP, just say that they require literacy and math skills. Whatever curriculum you use, they can use a GED curriculum to prepare them. Eventually down the road, once they get ready to take the final test, then they can receive their GED through adult ed, transition them over. Just don't call it that, right?
I think I'd want to think about that before I gave.
Yeah, there's always a way. There's always
confident
a way
answer,
figuring
right?
it out. Yeah.
But I think what you're getting at is there's a way to do this.
Right.
And it's just a matter of having taking the time to have the conversations to nail down some of the details here.
Right.
And Mike, that's what that work group is looking at, and asking for some guidance, because there are solutions, as you just said, but we want to do it with hopefully the student in mind,
right?
And making sure that the services that we are providing, and some of them are co-provided or should be co-provided in that sense, is that we don't have to play all these games to do it. We just want to be able to provide services that are.
Yeah, we always
that they
do.
should receive.
Yeah, we always do with the student in mind. It just has some of the stupid rules get in the way.
Right. In the guidance, right
Yeah.
now it's sad in that they're not sure how to guide for, it's been months and months and months. I think we started this last September and I don't think it's moved very far. And so for us, it was a solution of let's look and see what we can do as a provider and what is fair and legal, how we should do it. And the big part of it, again, as I'm fortunate to have the cooperation of all of those LEAs to provide those services and work together to make sure that our students are taken care of.
Who is this group to whom you refer?
So I just want to share one little last part here of kind of our why and what we're doing. And why it was important for us to go through and do what we did, look at those changes. It really made us look at our procedures. And first of all, we advocate for students all the time. We want to make sure that this process evaluates or elevates our student voice, because after they leave us, hopefully this process and those lessons learned, we want to make sure that they are empowered with the knowledge of the rights that they have, that cooperation between the Can I See Adult Ed program and our LEAs. There's funding on the side of the K-12 system that can support the students that way. Some of the things that I'd heard from other folks is that stigma of being a student with a disability. I hope this will help, at least in our process, remove that stigma. I think that was when that box was unchecked with us before. People didn't want to put it there because, ever since they were 10 years old or 12 years old, they were labeled special ed and weren't able to participate in the same ways as other folks. And so they hope that and having discussions with them that stigma wouldn't follow them, or they would have, and so we're trying to remove that. And I think the last thing, that's the law. And so we follow the law. We adjust our procedures. It wasn't, like I say, I won't say it wasn't super bad that we went through it, but it wasn't terribly unpleasant. But I think at the end of the day, it ended up with better results for our students. So as Patrick said, we've had some discussions about this, and maybe from the field we'll be able to check and see what type of future trainings. There's training that will be at the virtual conference. Hope that everyone will take part in that. And really, for us, it is important, again, to locate and find the students that may have disabilities, and then to provide those services that is much needed for them to be successful moving forward. So
thank you, Oogie, and thank you again to Michelle Driscoll and Oogie Lamar for the presentation. We hope that you will remember all of this. Hopefully you took the notes, but we will certainly get you all the information that you need. And I got my wrong thing here. Just want to remind everyone to sign up for the Spring Institute if you're interested in learning more information, and we'll make sure that you get all the accompanying documents. Thank you again to all of us that have contributed from our different vantage points. So we're all helping move the needle. Matt, I think we've roped you in to McKay. I don't know. I think you're a great asset, a resource that I'm sure that we will connect with. And Lori, if you'd like to stay on, I'm happy to address that question. But I want to be mindful of everyone's time as well. So take care, everyone, and we will see you soon.